I found something in my closet that I want to show you. I spotted Snail up on top of my shelf. Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in this video, I'm going to be showing you where Snail hides from Season 4 of Blue's Clues. There are 30 episodes. So with further ado, let's get into the episodes. The first episode is Magenta Gets Glasses. First, you can see Snail under the fish tank when Steve, Blue, Miranda, and Magenta go to the eye doctor. Next, you can see Snail next to the fish tank when Steve, Blue, Miranda, and Magenta are leaving the eye doctor. And finally, you can see Snail next on top of the bookcase when Steve and Blue look outside to see Magenta's house. The second episode is Environments. First, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve goes over to Blue in the bedroom to go on a trip. Next, you can see Snail next to a left and right arrow sign when Steve and Blue skidoo back home from the globe environment. And finally, you can see Snail on top of the drawer next to a cowboy hat in the bedroom when Steve and Blue were packing and getting ready to go on their desert trip. The third episode is Stormy Weather. First, you can see Snail in the plant when Steve asks if you want to go on a nature walk with them. Next, you can see Snail next to the right side of the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sing the Mealtime song. And finally, you can see Snail next to the sign when Steve and Blue skidoo back to the kitchen. The fourth episode is Blue's Collection. First, you can see Snail next to the fence when Steve goes over to Periwinkle's garage to show Steve his collections. Next, you can see Snail next to the fence when Steve, Shovel, and Blue skidooed into the beach book. And finally, you can see Snail next to the umbrella after Steve and Blue help Shovel find and collect his seashells. The fifth episode is Cafe Blue. First, you can see Snail next to side table drawer when Steve invites you inside. Next, you can see Snail next to the right side of the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sing the Mealtime song. And finally, you can see Snail next to the table on the right when Steve and Blue serve Pail, Shovel, Periwinkle, and Tickety Talk ice cream sandwiches. The sixth episode is Imagination. First, you can see Snail on side table drawer in front of the right side of the telephone after saying to play Blue's Clues song. Next, you can see Snail next to an apple tree when Steve was pretending to be in a boat to meet up with Periwinkle. And finally, you can see Snail next to the leg of the Imagine box next to Blue when Steve goes find the third clue, which were triangles. The seventh episode is Adventure. First, you can see Snail next to a long bush when Steve was heading over to meet up with Periwinkle. Next, you can see Snail next to a green bush when Steve and Blue skidooed into Storybook. And finally, you can see Snail on the left side of the thinking chair when Steve's saying the We Just Figured Out Blue's Clues song. The eighth episode is the Anything box. First, you can see Snail on top of a purple box when Steve and Blue skidooed into a diorama. And finally, you can see Snail on top of side table drawer next to the telephone when Steve's saying the We Just Figured Out Blue's Clues song. The ninth episode is Super Friends. First, you can see Snail behind the left side of the lamp on the table between the living room and bedroom when Steve and Blue were going to the bedroom to find their superheroes. Next, you can see Snail on top of the brick wall when Steve and Blue skidooed into a comic book of Superheroville. And finally, you can see Snail on the umbrella holder when Steve, Blue, Slippery Soap, Tickety Talk, and Frank were to find out if the sound is coming from the washing machine. The 10th episode is What's New, Blue. First, you can see Snail next to a flower when Steve was going outside to meet up with Shovel, Pill, and Sifter. Next, you can see Snail on the second row of the bookshelf next to a book when Steve meets up with Blue, Mr. Salt, and Mrs. Pepper, where Mr. Salt and Mrs. Pepper were reading a newspaper called the Skidoo News. And finally, you can see Snail in the backyard in front of a tree and next to a daisy when Steve tells everyone about Blue's news. The 11th episode is Blue's New Place. First, you can see Snail next to the bed in the living room when Steve was bringing Blue's things to make for her new place. Next, you can see Snail next to a blue dress-up box when Blue was showing Steve her new place. And finally, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve sang the We Just Figured Out Blue's Clues song. The 12th episode is Mr. Salt and Mrs. Pepper Day. First, you can see Snail on top of the snack table on a purple paper when Steve and Blue were going to the kitchen to make an announcement about Mr. Salt and Mrs. Pepper Day. And finally, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sang the Mealtime song. The 13th episode is The Baby's Here. First, you can see Snail on the table in front of a red vase with flowers and next to a pair of shoes between the living room and kitchen when Steve goes to the kitchen to find the first clue, which was a rattle. Next, you can see Snail next to a pink block in the waiting room of the hospital when Steve, Blue, and Paprika go see their new baby. And finally, you can see Snail next to Steve and Blue's driveway on their house when Steve and Blue were coming back from the hospital. The 14th episode is Making Changes. First, you can see Snail next to side table drawer after Steve and Blue sang to play Blue's Clue song. Next, you can see Snail on a towel basket next to a pink towel between the living room and bathroom when Steve goes to the bathroom to meet up with Slippery Soap, Mr. Salt, Mrs. Pepper, and Paprika, and Cinnamon when Cinnamon is taking a bath. And finally, you can see Snail next to a blue reading pillow before Steve and Blue skedaddle into Baby Bear's storybook. The 15th episode is Bugs. First, you can see Snail next to a yellow tulip and white daisy after Steve, Blue, and Periwinkle were watching a grasshopper. Next, you can see Snail in a huge size next to grass strips when Steve and Blue follow Aunt Antoinette with her crumb of where she lives. And finally, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair on the right side when Steve's saying that we just figured out Blue's Clue song. The 16th episode is Un Dia con Plum. First, you can see Snail next to a tree on the left side when Periwinkle showed Steve and Blue his new friend Plum. Next, you can see Snail next to the toy chest on the right side of the living room when Steve was going to the kitchen to look for the first clue, which is a pad of paper. And finally, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair on the right side when Steve's saying that we just figured out Blue's Clue song. The 17th episode is Something to Do, Blue. First, you can see Snail next to a white and red daisy flower when Steve went outside to see Periwinkle's magic trick. Next, you can see Snail next to a flower when Steve and Blue skedaddle into Something to Do Town. And finally, you can see Snail on the second row of the bookshelf when Steve and Blue skedaddle back home from Something to Do Town. The 18th episode is Blue's Book Nook. First, you can see Snail next to the bookshelf when Steve goes to the living room to meet up with Blue, where she was organizing the books. Next, you can see Snail next to the leg of table fruit when Steve and Blue goes to the library to find books about elephants. And finally, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve sang the So Long song. The 19th episode is Blue's School. First, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve was going to the living room to pick up Tickety, pretending to be a bus driver. Next, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sang the Mealtime song. And finally, you can see Snail next to a fence of flowers when Steve, Blue, Periwinkle, and Tickety Talk were on the bus going to the pizza parlor. The 20th episode is Rhyme Time. First, you can see Snail behind the right side of the toy chest in the living room when Steve was going to the kitchen to find the first clue, which was a pail. Next, you can see Snail on top of a well on top of a scale with a paw print clue in the rhyming storybook. And finally, you can see Snail behind the left side of the pool when Steve and Blue go to the backyard to rhyme about the beach. The 21st episode is What's Inside. First, you can see Snail next to a small doll toy in the bedroom when Steve shows something in the bedroom, which is a door. Next, you can see Snail next to a green bush when Steve and Blue skedaddle into the pull tab book to help Boris the bunny. And finally, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve and Blue were going to the bedroom to find the music box and get the key. The 22nd episode is Blocks. First, you can see Snail next to the toy chest when Steve, Blue, and Green Puppy skedaddle back home from the block construction site. And finally, you can see Snail next to side table drawer when Steve sang the So Long song. The 23rd episode is Blue's Big Musical Movie. First, you can see Snail between a drum and a clarinet when Steve skedaddled from the music sheet back to the backyard. Next, you can see Snail under the rock when a felt friend lifted it. And finally, you can see Snail on a skateboard and sings in an opera voice, I Just Want to Be Me, after Shovel and Pill's turn. The 24th episode is Let's Boogie. First, you can see Snail next to the toy chest when Steve was marching for the first clue in the kitchen, which was a pot. Next, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sang the Mealtime song. And finally, you can see Snail next to a yellow cube when Steve and Blue skedaddled back home from a block book. The 25th episode is Blue's Backyard Ball Game Bonanza. First, you can see Snail next to the toy chest when Steve was pretending to play ball catch with you when looking for the first clue, which was rolling. Next, you can see Snail next to the toy chest when Steve and Blue skedaddled into a stadium. And finally, you can see Snail inside the sandcastle when Steve wins the obstacle course. The 26th episode is Let's Plant. First, you can see Snail next to a yellow sunflower when Steve was showing you the plants in the backyard. Next, you can see Snail next to a tree and home frame when Steve and Blue skedaddled into All About Plants book. And finally, you can see Snail on top of the bookshelf in a plant when Steve and Blue Skidoo back home from All About Plants book and goes to the thinking chair. The 27th episode is Puppets. First, you can see Snail next to the purple table when Steve goes over to Slippery Soap and Tickety Talk to help them with their puppet story. Next, you can see Snail next to the bed in the bedroom when Steve goes over to Blue when Blue made a castle. And finally, you can see Snail next to a house near the giant when Steve finished drawing the third clue, which was a giant. The 28th episode is Joe and Tell. First, you can see Snail next to the lamp between the living room and bedroom when Steve goes to the bedroom to show you what Joe looks like. The 29th episode is Joe Gets a Clue. First, you can see Snail next to a tree in the backyard when Joe tries to find Steve. Next, you can see Snail next to the thinking chair when Steve and Blue sang the Mailtime song. And finally, you can see Snail next to the bookshelf when Steve, Joe, and Blue skidoo back from the block-shaped picture and goes to the thinking chair. And finally, the 30th episode is Steve Goes to College. First, you can see Snail next to a box with a lamp in it when Joe walks to the bedroom to see Steve pack for college. Next, you can see Snail next to the snack table in the living room when Steve and Joe go to the kitchen to find the first clue, which were numbers. And finally, you can see Snail from the window on the left side when Steve leaves for college. So those are all the episodes of Where Snail Hides from Season 4 of Blue's Clues. So hope you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.